A bright morning enveloped the Clodnier residence. Sunlight filtered through gently swaying leaves, casting soft patterns across the wide, tranquil courtyard. Birds chirped in harmony, marking the beginning of a day that seemed peaceful on the surface. An anxious voice called out for the young lady. A servant who had just entered the room suddenly halted in her tracks. At the same moment, the other servants turned their heads in the same direction. Once again, she called out to the young lady, her voice tinged with worry. She reminded her that the floor was cold and urged her to move somewhere warmer. The scene revealed Miesa lying on the cold marble floor. Her small body was curled up, her blonde hair scattered loosely around her face. Both of her hands clutched a tangled thread, winding it around her fingers. Her gaze was empty, as if she existed in a world separate from the room around her. She let out a faint murmur, but her body remained completely still. One of the servants looked at her hesitantly. She remarked that it didn't seem like the young lady had any intention of moving. The servant who had called out earlier spoke again, suggesting that they should approach and cover her themselves. Carefully, she lifted Miesa and placed her onto a thick, warm cloth. Her movements were slow and cautious, afraid of startling her. Speaking gently, she explained that the floor was too cold and hard, and that the young lady should always lie on something warm. She continued speaking softly, asking if it felt more comfortable now, whether she needed another cloth, or if she was feeling sleepy. Miesa gave no response. A quiet conversation began to flow among the servants. One of them commented that their colleague often spoke to herself like that, and that no matter what she said, the young lady would not understand. She sighed, feeling that such efforts were pointless. However, the servant beside her responded that perhaps the young lady understood little by little, even if she showed no reaction. Their conversation caught the attention of a red-haired servant sitting nearby. The topic shifted into soft whispers about the young master. The red-haired servant remarked that the master always stayed by the young lady's side and spoke to her, even though she seemed to understand nothing. She added that he cared for her deeply, so much so that the young lady almost never set foot on the ground. As she spoke, she mimicked the way Eric often carried Miesa. Another servant agreed, adding that the young master, who had never shown interest in women, had suddenly begun acting strangely. She wondered aloud if this might be the kind of woman he had always preferred. Their tone gradually became excessive, until a senior servant finally intervened. With a firm yet controlled voice, she reprimanded them. She questioned whether it wasn't natural for a husband and wife to share a close relationship, and why they felt the need to make an issue out of it. The surrounding servants stopped what they were doing. Some turned to look at the one being scolded, while others quickly lowered their gazes, unwilling to get involved. In a quieter, restrained voice, the servant replied that she hadn't meant it that way. The senior servant did not soften. Her expression remained stern as she warned her not to speak carelessly. If she did not wish to be driven out, she should watch her words. There were many ears listening. Silence fell over the room. The servant who had been beside Miesa stepped closer. Leaning slightly forward, her brows lifted in mild confusion at the sudden shift in atmosphere. In a curious tone, she asked what they had been talking about and why it had suddenly gone quiet. Her question made one of the seated servants glance sideways. With her head lowered, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric on her lap, she answered in a soft, awkward voice that it was nothing. After a brief pause, she spoke again. This time, she brought up the young lady, saying that she would surely look even more beautiful if she wore finer clothes than the ones she usually wore. It felt like a waste, since she always dressed so simply. Her remark prompted others to respond. One servant nodded slightly and pointed out that the young lady's clothes got dirty quickly, which was why she kept wearing such simple garments. The others murmured in agreement. Then, as if struck by an idea, one of them spoke up. If the problem was that her clothes got dirty easily, why not make a special apron for her? The servant beside her turned and gave a small nod. They began discussing the idea of making an apron for Miesa. One of them suggested that it could be made beautifully, even decorated with embroidery. She imagined suitable designs and proposed a yellow floral pattern, thinking it would suit the young lady perfectly. However, on the other side of the room, the three servants who had been gossiping about Misa and Eric looked displeased. Their expressions tightened, brows slightly furrowed. One crossed her arms, while another looked away, with her lips pressed thin. Their irritation was clear. Meanwhile, in the backyard of the Cladnier estate, the family's soldiers trained under Eric's supervision. He stood upright with his arms crossed over his chest. His gaze occasionally lifted toward the sky, as though something else occupied his thoughts. He wondered if it was already past lunchtime had the young lady eaten. Even earlier that morning, she hadn't seemed very spirited. Before long, he ended the training earlier than usual. On his way back into the mansion, Eric recalled when Miesa had first arrived, she had been just as unresponsive, staying in her room all day. Perhaps even now she had not eaten lunch, nor played with the servants. A servant soon approached and bowed respectfully before delivering a report. She explained that before lunch, the young lady had fallen by the riverbank in the garden. After being bathed and fed, she had fallen asleep. She was now in the servants' workroom. Eric was visibly startled upon hearing that Miesa had fallen near the river. The servant clarified that it had happened when Miesa stopped to look at the fish by the river while walking with the lady of the house on the way to the church. Eric did not respond at length. He simply gave a short nod. If she had been with his mother, then it likely hadn't been too dangerous. He averted his gaze, a faint smile forming as he thought that Miesa had unexpectedly been quite busy all day. In his mind, he pictured her small figure with a bright, innocent smile. As they continued walking, the servant added that the young lady did not seem to like the church. Eric responded that perhaps she was bored from having to sit too long. However, the servant elaborated further. At first, the young lady had been willing to go along, but upon arriving at the church, she had started muttering complaints from the very entrance. Because of that, she had waited outside with the servants until the lady of the house finished her prayers. Hearing this, Eric glanced to the side, but said little. He wondered briefly whether she would be fine if given sweets like before. He then stopped walking and turned slightly, giving a clear instruction. From now on, sweet snacks were to be prepared every day and placed on the table without fail. The servant nodded in understanding. The scene shifted. From outside the window, Eric could be seen accompanying Miesa in the dining room. Miesa opened her mouth wide. As Eric fed her, he remarked that she was eating quite well today. As usual, Miesa gave no response. She simply swung her legs slowly. Seeing her calmer than usual, Eric felt a quiet sense of relief. While watching her, he reminded her not to eat only the meat, but the vegetables as well. Miesa tried to follow. Eric then picked up a piece of meat and layered it with vegetables, preparing to feed her. However, just as he brought it closer, a piece of vegetable slipped and fell right onto Miesa's chest. At first, Eric intended to take another piece to replace it, but then he told her that he would clean it instead. He moved to retrieve the fallen piece, yet the spot where it landed made his hand pause briefly. With hesitation, he slowly reached out. There was a trace of awkwardness in his movement, but he carefully and politely picked up the piece. As Eric pulled his hand back, passing in front of Miesa's face, her eyes widened, her gaze fixed directly on the piece of vegetable held between his fingers. Miesa suddenly moved, trying to take it back. Reflexively, Eric stopped her. He only meant to prevent her from eating something that had already fallen. But in an innocent, unexpected motion, Miesa bit his finger. It wasn't hard, on the contrary. It was soft. Her lips brushed lightly against the tip of Eric's finger for a brief moment. Eric flinched and quickly pulled his hand back, his expression tightening. Miesa was just as startled, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Her brows lowered, and her lips pursed into a clear pout. Several seconds passed in silence. Then suddenly, Miesa grabbed the tablecloth and yanked it hard. Plates, glasses, and food scattered across the floor. The sound of breaking dishes filled the room. The dining room door opened. Deal, a servant from the palace, peeked through the gap. Her sharp gaze swept across the disordered room, food scattered across the floor, the empty table, and Miesa sitting still with bits of food clinging to her hair. Eric and Miesa both remained motionless. Without a word, Deal stepped inside and grabbed Miesa by the arm, telling her to come at once. Miesa did not resist. She stood and followed, leaving behind the dining room still filled with silence and the remnants of the mess. As her eyes briefly glanced toward Miesa, Deal wondered to herself whether Miesa ever grew tired of causing a scene every time she ate. Meanwhile, Eric remained silent. His hand rested on his thigh, the mark of Miesa's bite still clearly visible on his index finger. Time passed, and night fell. In the bedroom, Eric and Miesa lay on the same bed, turned away from each other, a clear distance between them. Moonlight streamed through the window, softly illuminating the room. Eric was still awake, his hand clenched slightly, his thoughts in disarray. His mind drifted back to the dining room. The faint sensation at his fingertips still lingered, making him fall into silence longer than he should. He thought to himself that Miesa was indeed his wife, yet she was no different from a child. Perhaps she did not even understand that he was her husband. Eric knew her condition. She was not someone who could comprehend such relationships. He understood the boundaries he must not cross. He turned his face to the side, his hand rising to cover part of it, as if trying to hide his own expression. Between his fingers, a clear flush spread across his cheeks, reaching up to his ears. His eyes were tightly shut, his brows slightly drawn, not in anger, but in an attempt to suppress the embarrassment that resurfaced as he recalled the moment. His breath caught for a second before slowly escaping. His shoulders tensed slightly, his fingers pressing gently against his face, as though trying to steady himself. A mix of awkwardness and disbelief at his own reaction, something he rarely showed, left him in silence, sinking into the lingering embarrassment that refused to fade.